Good afternoon, and welcome to an inside look at Management Publication of the Year Awards. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. I'm very pleased to open out this event, which is a partnership between the Chartered Management Institute, the British Academy of Management, and the Chartered Association of Business Schools in association with the British Library, as we look to unearth the deepest and most robust thinking around management theory and practice and its impact on wider practice and policy. And I'm very glad to be joined this afternoon by Anne Franke, who's Chief Executive of the CMI, by Professor Robert McIntosh, who's Chair of CABS and Pro-Vice Chancellor for Business and Law at Northumbria University, and Professor Katie Mason, President of BAM, and Professor of Markets and Management at Lancaster University. Thank you all for joining me this afternoon, and thank you for all of you for joining us this afternoon. Now, I'm just going to say a few words about the Management Publication of the Year Awards themselves, but before handing over to Anne, Katie, and Robert to discuss exactly what we're trying to achieve more broadly from these awards. There'll be lots of opportunity to ask questions. Please do submit questions throughout, and we'll try and get to them either during or after the panelists have spoken. And we'll try and get this as interactive as possible. This will be shared with the wider community as well after this event, and there's lots of people who'll be wanting to submit their own work to these awards, so we'll ensure that everybody possible gets access to this discussion today. Now, just some words about the Management Publication of the Year Awards themselves. BAM, CMI, CABS, and the British Library have been having an ongoing conversation around how to raise the profile of the amazing research that is taking place into management and business across the UK. We want to emphasise its impact on practice within business and organisations, and on policy, and the potential for even further impact in those arenas. And we thought a Management Publication of the Year Awards was a good mechanism to do this, to really highlight all that amazing work that is going on. So, we're looking to celebrate existing published work of substantive research that brings forward sort of fresh thinking and rigorous insight posed against some of the most pressing challenges faced by the UK and beyond. And the three categories are sustainable futures. We're looking at, to celebrate research that sets out how business and other organisations can positively impact people and the planet. SME growth, and we're talking about, in the middle of an election campaign, talking about growth and productivity is a big part of the agenda. What has the management research community done to promote how productivity can be brought to bear on future prosperity? And the final category is social enterprise and innovation, looking beyond business into purpose and those business and organisations that exist to have a positive community or societal benefit. So we want to celebrate the value that is offered. We want to celebrate where that research has impact. Submissions must have been published in the previous 18 months or so, but they can be in any format. They can include a podcast, an article series, a research paper or papers, or piece of academic research. But this must represent a sort of substantive body of research. We have a rigorous process to evaluate submissions. We're looking for things that go beyond, say, an individual journal article and have deeper research behind them, and look to engage across a number of different formats and with different audiences potentially. So the winning entries in those categories, and an overall winner, will demonstrate the impact of the research transforming practice or addressing those sort of pressing challenges that the UK is facing. So we want to really make sure that we're leaning into the socioeconomic, environmental concerns of society. So that's the background to the awards. That's what we're trying to achieve through it. It's the deadline for submissions is July the 5th, so it's relatively quickly, and then there will be a rigorous process to assess the various submissions that we've received across those three categories, and then thinking about an overall winner, which will be launching at a prestigious ceremony in the British Library in February next year. So that's a bit of background, and I'm going to pass over to our panelists to give us a bit more of their thinking as to why the respective organisations have come together to put together these awards. I'm going to hand over to Anne Franke to begin with. And Anne, it'd be good to know why the awards are important from a practitioner perspective, and how you see the awards bringing fresh thinking to bear on some of the UK's most pressing challenges around management and leadership.
Sure. Thank you, Anthony, and good afternoon, everybody. I'm delighted to be here. As you will know, I hope, CMI, the Chartered Management Institute, is the chartered professional body for management and leadership, and we have an extensive partner network. We work with many of you on the call, about 150 universities, and also we have about 200,000 learners in our community. We do exist, we say, to turn accidental managers into competent, capable, inclusive leaders. And this has been our mission for over 75 years. And one of the things that we're constantly surprised by is we're not surprised, we know management and leadership are absolutely vital to the success of the country. And it really doesn't matter if you are working in the public or private sector, if you're an SME or a large multinational, how you manage and lead really matters. And we know this from our extensive body of research, which I'm going to cover in just a moment, just touch on some of these statistics. But the really astounding thing that we still encounter is how little this seems to be understood by policymakers, by government, even by some practitioners themselves. We tend to understate the role of management and leadership in things like growth, productivity, improving the delivery of our public sector services. All of these areas, management and leadership is absolutely critical. And yet, for example, when CMI asks MPs, how critical do you think management and leadership is to your growth and productivity, or the growth and productivity agenda of this country? Only about 1 in 5 say it's very important. Most people, most MPs, the ones setting the policies, don't quite appreciate just how vital it is. Now, I said that actually it isn't only the government, perhaps, that doesn't appreciate how important it is and the role it plays. We know that the population at large, even managers themselves, tend to perhaps understate the role of management and leadership versus technical competence in their own career impacts. For example, we found in our Better Managed Britain campaign, which we launched last fall, that a staggering 82% of UK managers are promoted into management and leadership roles with, you guessed it, absolutely no training in how to manage and lead themselves or others or resources. So clearly we have a nation of accidental managers, and we do, by the way, have 8 million managers in our workforce, and that is a number that is only expected to grow. So this is an absolutely critical aspect of improving our productivity and improving our growth, both in the private and public sector. And we've taken a look at, how could we possibly quantify this impact? So Anthony and his team have taken a look at this. And what we know, for example, is when we look at the UK and we look at the UK's rank globally, we're 6th, well behind places like the US and Germany. We also know from previous research done by respected academics that it's estimated that about half that productivity gap in the UK between those leaders is down to management and leadership. We've actually done some calculations that show that if, for example, the UK matched Germany in its management and leadership practice, that it would increase the economy by the equivalent of 76 billion over the next decade. And if we had matched it in the past, it would have been worth 127 billion to us. So these are some very, very big numbers indeed. So it is an absolutely vital part of our skill base. It's vital that we address it to achieve those national outcomes of growth and productivity. Now, I mentioned the public sector because you might be thinking, well, that's fine, but how do we measure productivity in the public sector? Well, management and leadership matters just as much here. We've taken a look, for example, at the role of management and leadership in the NHS, and 62% of NHS managers and leaders have told us that actually that lack of efficient and effective management, the bureaucracy of their own management, gets in the way of delivering better outcomes. So it is an incredibly important aspect as well, not just in the private sector, but also in the public sector. And we would be well advised, as they do in other countries that score perhaps higher than the UK on this topic, to make sure that we actually ask for experience and credentials in management and leadership when we're, for example, advertising for managerial roles. Now, the good news is management and leadership can be learned. And we know that at CMI. We do a lot of standards of best practice in conjunction with our university and academic friends. And we look at this and we keep it refreshed. And we know it makes a huge impact on individuals. So, for example, if you're looking at inclusive cultures, we know that inclusive cultures drive employee engagement and job satisfaction, and driving employee engagement and job satisfaction drives organizational outcomes. So basically, there's a lot of evidence that suggests this. The more engaged your employees are, the more satisfied they are with their roles, the more productive they are, the better your organizational outcomes. That's very important. Well, it happens that trained managers, and we're going to be releasing this shortly, this work, are better at role modeling these inclusive behaviors and inspire greater trust and job satisfaction in their employees than non-trained managers. So clearly, we know that for an individual, this makes a difference. And we also see it when we are measuring the impact of chartered manager, for example, where we know that they add about 20,000 pounds of value to GVA. So it's very important. It's also important given the work shifts we've had. Now, I'm sure there'll be some interesting research, I'm hoping, in this award on the new way of working, hybrid working. Again, at CMI's research, we know that most organizations are still working in a hybrid manner, 84%. And actually, the majority of managers tell us it's opened up new opportunities from where you recruit, who you recruit, and what they can do and who they are. It tends to actually enable you to recruit a more diverse workforce. But how do you manage in this? It puts new strains and stresses on managers to manage in that hybrid world. You really have to know how to do it. And it is skills and training that are required there. So that's a really interesting area to explore. Additionally, we also know that we're for the first time, we have 5 generations, 5 in the workplace. That's a huge number of generations. Why? Because people are working longer. Obviously, people are retiring later. They're having to work well into their 60s and 70s. And yet 92% of managers tell us that although they bring a huge amount of expertise to the workplace, very few are still actively recruiting them. So I think it's less than half are actively targeting these older workers, and yet they're becoming more and more of a phenomenon as our society ages. And finally, another area that you might look at is insecure work. So we know that we do have about 30% of people in this country that are on things like 0-hour contracts, or they just don't have secure work. And obviously that has a very negative impact on well-being and productivity. So there's a whole wealth of themes that we could explore that are extremely relevant. Obviously, the sustainability theme that Anthony mentioned is something that's very fast emerging. And again, Our research shows that not enough information is made available on how managers and leaders can practice sustainability every day in their places of work. So there's rich pickings for you to submit your work. We want to celebrate the work that we know goes on in the vibrant business school community. We want to tie it up more completely and readily with practice. And we're really overall with you working to raise the importance of management and leadership as a critical element in the future growth and prosperity of the UK. And we're really looking forward to your submissions as to how we can do that. So thank you.
Great, thank you, Anne. So it matters to businesses, public services, other organizations when it comes to productivity, growth, environmental or green transition and social impact. So, this is an essential opportunity to draw on the deepest knowledge and insights to try to impact the conversation amongst policymakers and practitioners around all those areas. Now I'm going to pass over to Katie and Robert. Talk a bit about what the academic community can gain from these awards, and then maybe a little about what the judges may be looking for as we move towards shortlisting and so on. Robert, perhaps I can come to you first and ask, so why do these awards matter so much to the business and management academic community?
Thanks, Anthony, and thanks, Anne, for your opening remarks. I think we're all agreed about the importance of high-quality thinking and insight about how to manage and lead, and the difference that makes to individuals, to society, to businesses, to the economy. So, go back to your question, Anthony. Why do these new awards matter to members of the academic community who do research on business and management? First of all, there might be 8 million managers in the UK workforce, but the community of researchers who do work on business and management is the second largest community of researchers of any discipline in the UK. So it's a huge community across the well over 100 business schools and schools of management in the UK. And many of the people on this call will be members of that community, so it'll be very familiar to them, but maybe less so to CMI members, that there is a really obvious performance measurement system imposed by the UK government called the Research Excellence Framework. It happens periodically. The next one is due to happen in 2029. And that has a huge bearing on what we as individual academics do to score as well as we individually and collectively can in that exercise. But a really damning statistic from my perspective is that at the REF 2021 exercise, 97% of the material that we put forward for evaluation was in the form of journal articles. And those journal articles are short form articles largely read by other academics, not by the 8 million practicing managers in the UK. And I think the Management Publication of the Year is important for two reasons. First of all, that it celebrates the quality of the work that we do, which is important, and I think that's a fantastic thing. But to go back to your question for a second time, why might this particular award matter? It's because it will recognise and celebrate other forms than the individual journal article. Just not to suggest that journal articles aren't important, they play a huge part. But I don't think they're 97% important. And I think as a community, we have really lost sight of the importance of longer form arguments in books. Books have shaped our society over millennia, and yet we seem to have lost sight of their importance. I think book forms and other newer forms are really important. This conversation today is not happening in a printed manual circulated in the way that a book would have been centuries ago, nor in the form of a journal article, but in the form of a digital consumption experience. And if you think about the way in which you consume any other information in your life, it's highly likely to involve blogs and vlogs and social media and other types of things. And yet we don't really have a space to acknowledge how we communicate insights about management practice to practicing managers. And so the publication of the year isn't called Book of the Year, although books are hugely important. It is deliberately called Publication of the Year because it might be a blog series, it might be a webinar series, it might be some other innovative way of getting high quality ideas out in accessible ways to practicing managers. And before I hand to Katie, I'll just leave you with one other big number. Since Anne mentioned 8 billion and I've mentioned 97%, my other big number is 1665. which is when the world's first peer-reviewed journal publications appeared. And it strikes me that in the period since 1665, quite a lot has changed. And yet for us as individual academics, very little has changed in terms of how we communicate high-quality thinking to the outside world. We do our research, we write it up, we send it to our peers, we pick it apart, and if it passes that test, we publish it. But we publish it in places that practicing managers tend not to read. And so I think there's a real importance about recognising that and celebrating it. And that's why I think these awards should matter to our community.
Brilliant. Thank you, Robert. And I noticed already there are questions appearing in the chat, which I'll come to in a moment. But before that, I'd like to hand over to Katie to follow up on Robert's comments and Anne's comments, but also to give a sense of the sorts of things that the judges will be looking for as they delve into this very varied group of works that will be submitted.
Thank you. So I think there is a massive transition going on in our economy at the moment. We are a greening economy. We are having conversations, quite rightly, as Anne said, about inclusivity and the changing nature of our workforce and changing nature of working, which are opening up whole new opportunities for us. And then we're doing this in a context where I guess it's quite difficult for a lot of small and medium-sized enterprises to access the academic knowledge, so it quite often sits behind paywalls. And so we're really interested in opening that dialogue and creating new interface between business and practice and supporting that initiative. And so we're really looking for, one of the criteria that we're looking for is originality, and that's originality in content. It's making an important innovation contribution to understanding and knowledge, but also in its format, in the way it's reaching out to people and being able to communicate with people that really need access to this type of knowledge to help them think about the work that they're doing. There's no magic formula in academic research. It is research like any other form of research. But what it does is it equips people to think differently about their setting. And so presenting that original thought and making it accessible is really, really critical. I think the second key element that we're really interested in is around significance. And so this means it needs to matter to the scholarly community. And so for us, that often takes the form of theoretical development, conceptualization, and that work is really important because theorizing and conceptualizing helps us understand phenomena in new ways and then develop new interventions to shape the future. So significance is really important, but it's not just significance to scholarly communities, it's significance to policy and practice community, both in the public and private sector, and we're really serious about that. But in order for that to be impactful, we need to make sure that it's based on rigorous research. So rigor is going to be an important part of how we look and judge these submissions. So it needs to demonstrate intellectual coherence, it needs to have integrity, and it needs to have robust and appropriate concepts, analysis, and methodologies. And they may be presented differently because of the different formats, but what is really important that we need to see that underpinning everything that is presented as knowledge. And so those are the criteria that we'll be looking for. And just as Robert said, those will be very familiar to people who have been engaged in any way with the Research Excellence Framework exercise in the UK.
Brilliant. Thank you, Katie. And you've gone some way to answering some of the questions that have been put in the chat thus far, but I'm going to bring them to the surface and I'll try and answer them, but feel free to correct course so I don't get it quite right. But so from the circular economy innovation communities have asked, would a webinar series be an eligible submission? Alternatively, additionally, would a series of video case studies be eligible? And I think it seems very clear from the criteria that you set there, which is the originality of content and format plus significance and rigor, Katie, that yes, they would be submittable, but they would have to have obviously that deep rigor of research sitting behind them. I think that's probably the right way of putting it. Perhaps.
That's right, absolutely.
And then Sudabe Belorian has asked, on the nomination form, section 5, it seems that only digital publications and books are acceptable. It doesn't include journal articles. Are journal articles eligible? And from what you were saying, Katie, again, we're not saying they're not eligible, but just standalone journal articles, there would need to be more to it than that. It'd be a series or be linked with other formats as well. Does that sound about right?
Yeah, I think it's really helpful to think about, would this be equivalent to a book? Has it got a coherence to it? Does it come together? And is it speaking as a body of work? And I think that's what we're trying to look at. This isn't another journal paper award. There are plenty of those. This is something distinctly different.
Great, thank you.
Can I add on to the end of that, Anthony? I think some of the academics that I am most impressed by over my career often do a big piece of research on how, for example, firms are innovating, or how firms are creating more inclusive cultures, or how they've internationalized. And then from that body of work, they will often produce a book and a whole series of journal articles picking up individual aspects of that research, and sometimes the kinds of other short form things, so things that end up in things like Management Today or Harvard Business Review, or that are not quite like a journal article and have a different audience. But underneath that, there's one body of work that they've done. And so you often see a book and a paper or series and a couple of other articles and maybe a short film. And so that kind of thing, I think, is exactly what we're looking for, rather than a one-off journal article on a specific topic. Great.
Thank you, Robert. And Erica Rascon asks, can we access this video later today to share it with colleagues? The answer is yes. And in fact, we will share that across our various social media feeds, LinkedIn, various email newsletters, and please do share it with colleagues as wide and far as possible, because the closing date is fast approaching, July the 5th. Okay, I'm going to widen the discussion out a little and explore some of the themes that have come up in those initial comments. And I'm going to come back to you, actually. And Robert there mentioned the Harvard Business Review, but why do you think business and management research in the UK doesn't perhaps seem to have the same high profile of similar sort of research in the US, where it's read in far more widely distributed publications such as the Harvard Business Review?
Yeah, I think it does go back, and obviously I don't think there's any one single answer, but it goes back to what I was saying in my opening remarks about reflecting the importance of management in doing your work. The UK, well, as we know, the US ranks higher in management and leadership, but they also are much more overt about requiring a management and leadership qualification. So I think the statistic that we unearthed from Anthony's work is that it's about 10 percentage points more likely in the US to list management qualifications as a prerequisite for applying for a management role than it is here. And that statistic I mentioned, about 82% of people getting no training when they do enter managerial roles, shows that actually, there are too many employers, not all employers, but too many employers that still don't believe in investing in the training of managers and leaders in their own organizations. And I think that needs to be addressed. And we hope that by working with our business school and research community, we can help address that, perhaps by unearthing some of those benefits. And then, of course, I think some of it is cultural. It doesn't help that, David Brent in The Office was such an icon in this country and became many people's idea of, the stereotypical manager. And there is the cult of the gifted amateur as well, which is kind of a cultural thing. None of those things point toward taking this perhaps as seriously as we should. It is absolutely not the only reason, but I think that many of those reasons roll into perhaps overlooking this. And again, we hope with these awards to not only make all that work that you're all doing much more visible and impactful, but also to amplify the role that management and leadership plays in achieving our outcomes as individuals, organizations, and as a country.
Great, thank you, Anne. And yes, that research, we looked at labour market data in the US and the UK, and we saw there was just a large difference in terms of that specification of the knowledge, skills, and training that you need to be a manager in the US versus the UK. There's also been some research that's come out earlier this week from the National Foundation for Educational Research that shows the occupational class across the board most likely to state that it was underskilled in terms of what was required to do the job in the context of essential employment skills like collaboration, communication, problem solving, were managers. And it shows that managers in the UK themselves are identifying that they may have a skills gap against what is required to do their role. It's a very powerful bit of research. Katie and Robert, I don't know whether you want to say anything on that on that reflection on the UK versus the US and profile for research.
I will happily add something, and Katie, you might want to speak to. I think for me, there's a relationship, Anthony, between the individual who's doing the research and notionally trapped in some ivory tower-like existence separate from the real world, and they might be doing research on management. And then at the other end of the spectrum, how that set of insights are communicated. And it's actually quite difficult to find examples of academics who do amazing research, who are themselves by nature amazing communicators and have the channel to get that amazing message out at scale. And I think the Harvard Business Review dominates globally, not just in the US, because it is a particular kind of outlet in which high quality research is transformed into a more digestible format with some kind of takeaways and insights. And it's quite provocative and it's very slickly produced. If in the UK, to contrast with a UK-based experience, where might some of those 8 million managers that Anne mentioned earlier get ideas about how to lead? I suspect one of the most influential people in the last 5 or 10 years has been Stephen Bartlett's Diary of a CEO series, which, and to pick up a question from Metza on the chat, that's available as a book, it's available as a kind of YouTube channel or blog, it's available in multiple formats. Stephen Bartlett is a consummate communicator and an entrepreneur. He's not an academic researcher. He's drawing on other people's academic research and communicating ideas about that. And I guess for me, this management publication of the year is to try to find examples where academics themselves have noticed the need to communicate in a different tone of voice with a different audience in ways which are impactful. And that might be in more than one format. But, none of us as individual academics might hold a candle to the global superstardom or the number of TikTok followers of some of these high-profile consummate communications professionals. But finding examples of really high-quality work that's making a difference and communicating that effectively, celebrating that alongside the kinds of more narrowly defined academic excellence that the Research Excellence Framework imposes on us, is what I would like to see most out of this publication of the year initiative in its first year.
Great. Kate, I don't know whether you want to add anything to this question or we can move on to the next one.
So I think very briefly, just to say that it's worth thinking about the power of relevant examples. So quite often, of course, our people have access to the Harvard Business Review just like everybody else. But then I guess there's something about the nature of British business, the nature of culture, situated practice, and the challenges that the translation piece makes to the challenges that it makes to the communication and translation of research. So they're doing a translation piece when they have access to new information, new management knowledge. And on top of that, the speed and pace of change around technologies, around the acceleration of the Anthropocene and the challenges we're going to face about the greening economy transitions, the challenges we face about social innovation and making sure that our economy is an inclusive economy, an everyone economy, as the Chartered Management Institute calls it. I think those sorts of concerns are really at the centre of us branching out to new forms of communication, but also trying to get recognition in academic circles and trying to be able to recognise high quality work when it takes that different format. And I think this award is doing a really important role there, which is far beyond what the Harvard Business Review are currently doing at the moment. And I think it offers new opportunities for dialogue with practice and with academic worlds.
Great. Thank you, Katie. That really helped open it out. And I also liked Robert sort of, the linking the research to channel to actually it being used in sort of practice, if you like. And my next question is in that arena really. What do we need to do in order to better increase the engagement of business and policy makers in critical management research? Of course, it's very critical when it comes to public services. It's very directly what is delivered by policy makers ultimately. But what do we need to do to increase that engagement, do you think? Maybe, Robert, you could take that one first.
So I think there are two challenges to us as an academic community. One is about the speed at which we move, and the other is about the digestibility of the output. And I'll say something about both of those very briefly, if you'll permit me, Anthony.
Yes.
In order to do a really rigorous piece of research, you might end up taking quite a long time over it, because if I interviewed one manager and discovered that having coffee before your first meeting of the day makes you more effective, that might not turn out to be that scientifically rigorous or substantive. So it might be that you need a longer period of time to observe interventions or a larger set of data to triangulate and check your findings, and so sometimes our pace is slower because we want to do a really thorough, exhaustive, rigorous piece of work. And yet the way in which we publish and the way in which we do peer review and the way in which we set up and fund research often mitigates against quick response, sometimes for legitimate reasons, but sometimes just because that's the way in which our industry has traditionally been structured for centuries. And I do think that, again, if I reflect on my own experience of consuming any other kind of information these days, it's relatively quick. And if in the first 30 seconds of a YouTube video on how to change a light bulb, I haven't got the key messages, I'll start scrolling. And so the speed is one challenge to that. And then the other is the digestibility thing. And I said earlier that Stephen Bartlett, who I've got no shares in or no political interest in, he's a consummate communicator. And I think the skill in writing densely argued, theoretically rich, peer-reviewed academic work for review by other academics is not the same skill. It's related to, but not the same skill as the ability to say succinctly, if you're a manager, what should you actually do about this challenge? And I do think that we need to force ourselves to try and learn that new communication skill. And so for me, those are the two challenges that our academics, sitting in a system which incentivizes one kind of behavior, but trying to talk to a community of practicing managers who've got different needs, that's what we need to pick up on. The ability to do our work quickly enough to respond to what is these days a rapidly changing regulatory, technological, economic environment, and to deliver insights in ways which allow us to see that being heard by the audience that we're trying to talk to, using language that they find familiar, using technology and platforms that they find accessible in a format that they find works for them. And that probably aren't the things that we've been trained to do over centuries of academic practice.
So, Anne, picking up on that point, so be agile, make it digestible. Is there anything else that you could think of that could help improve engagement of business practitioners, public service leaders, and policymakers in the rigorous research that we have across our business schools?
Well, I completely agree with what Robert was saying about making clear communication to practitioners a very high priority, because that is how you cut through. And if you think about the things that have cut through from the management and leadership lexicon, it's tended to be things that somehow do have a readily identifiable meaning to people and expressing that in clear and simple language. So I am absolutely all for that. And not surprisingly, if we look at what tops the list of traits of good managers and leaders, nobody, least of all Robert, will be surprised to learn that clear communication, or the ability to communicate, which by the way includes listening as well as communicating, tops the list. So it is a very, very important aspect for us to consider. The other thing that I think is really important for the practitioner community is applied knowledge and impact. So let's call it the so what factor. It's, well, if I use this in my small business or in my medium-sized business or with my team today, what difference will it make? How will it help me? What is the impact of what I'm doing? And can I see it as a practitioner? And again, unlocking those practical impacts, I think, is a critical aspect of what we're looking for. And as Robert says, it is a little bit perhaps of a shift in some of the more academic work, but I think it's vitally important for practitioners that there is a so what. And if you think about one of the areas where I think we're seeing quite a lot of that research, almost every day, if I go back to some of those challenges I've discussed about hybrid working, for example, the practical impacts of how do you do that well as an organization? What are the benefits of doing that well? We're still learning. There's a huge amount of learning going on there. And yet that's something that we all experience. So I think that the practicality of things also is about their relevance, how widespread. Actually, Katie mentioned the importance of inclusivity. Again, something incredibly relevant that we know impacts a huge number of individuals. So really, it's about the clarity of the communication, the practicality of the impact, and the relevance of the problem. And I think all of those things are very important in helping to unlock and shape this award.
Okay, clarity, practicality, impact. Katie, to go back to Anne's point around so what, there aren't many bigger so what's than sustainability, adoption of technology, inclusivity that Anne, yourself have already mentioned. How much do you think it's the role of business academics in order to influence future policy, future business practice, rather than simply exploring it?
So I think that's a really interesting question, because I think business and management researchers are changing the way they do research. And I see a shift much more to transdisciplinary research, so working with people from very different sorts of disciplines. But in that definition is the engagement of the people who are likely to be impacted by the research. So they actually become part of the research framing, as well as participants in the research and enrolling other participants in the research. So that engaged research, action research, sometimes it's called grand challenge-led research, which always has a pathway to impact and engagement built into it. Sometimes it's called responsible research and innovation, and there's often an education part of that, where people are trying to reach out to the public and say why management research is important, because everybody manages. Economics came out trying to manage households. That's how the discipline developed. And so thinking about our roots, our responsibility, and I think in that way, instead of just looking backwards to see what's happened and why it's happened, it gives us an opportunity to look forwards and be much more anticipatory in the way that we think about the findings of our research and the way that we open up that conversation, as Anne was saying, about the so what. And I think that's where there's an opportunity to create new sorts of platforms for dialogue and to be much more inclusive of not just business leaders and managers and workers and people impacted by organizations and organizing in the research itself, but to give them a voice in that research in a slightly different way in some of the outputs that we present and in the formats that we present them.
Brilliant, thank you. Katie, and I'm take it, Robert. That's what you've seen as well. It's beyond observation. It's about anticipation, shaping, involvement, sort of responsible research, transdisciplinary approaches. I take it that's a trend line that you can observe readily as well.
Yeah, and I also think it's really important, Anthony, to just draw attention back to the respecting and honouring the quality of the academic insight. So this is, high quality research in the management publication of the year is important. It's not that you could just think this up in 2 or 3 minutes and then write a book about it. So the underpinning quality of the scholarship is important, because that's why we have academic institutions. But the translation into something which is timely and relevant and actionable is a related but different skill. And Anne's example of what should we be doing about hybrid working is a really great example. There's not that much value in knowing that, well, in 15 years' time, I'll be able to have done this longitudinal study, which will tell us what works, because people are facing that challenge here and now. Equally, well, I tried this yesterday and it worked, so we should just all do it, isn't particularly helpful either. Academics face this temporal challenge of trying to bring deep insight in as timely a way as possible. But look at the transition that happened in all of our working lives. Everybody on this call will have been impacted during lockdown when we were forced to work entirely remotely. And most of us, I would suspect, are still wrestling a bit with, well, what is the right mix to come out of that? How much choice for the employer? How much choice for the employee? How much coordination? I am sure most of us are in conversations about how much office space and what kind of office space and where, and does it matter, and how does it matter? And so those are the things that a practicing manager, one of Anne's 8 million practicing managers in the UK, would be thinking, goodness, if I could read a book or watch a podcast and discover something useful about that in the next bit of my life, that would be really impactful. I don't think that those people would go off and subscribe to an academic journal and read a 12,000 word article full of mostly things that they haven't read before. But they probably do want to access that insight, and it's not to disrespect the quality of the scholarship, nor to trivialize the packaging part of it. It's actually this really interesting blend of those two, which is the most important.
Brilliant. Thank you, Robert. And I'm guessing that you've observed the changes that have happened. You're in dialogue with business leaders all the time. There is a bit of a sense on things like, new forms of working, hybrid working, how you manage that environment, so on. Often the decisions are made on an instinctive basis. Sometimes they can be a bit knee-jerk in cases, and there does sometimes seem to be a deficit of good quality research available in consumable format at the right time to help that sort of decision making. Is that the sort of situation you recognise?
Oh, absolutely. I think, Robert summed it up really well. And I think hybrid working is a great example. I think sustainability is another great example, as is AI. These are all, really important topics that we're grappling with, and we don't know how to do it, right? If we're honest. And so actually getting high quality, rigorous research to give us insights in how better to do it and how better to cope with these here and now challenges now and the foreseeable future in our lives, I think would be hugely additive and really make a big difference to the management and leadership, the practicing community. And as I say, I think that all of those challenges are faced not just by small businesses and large multinationals, but by the public sector and third sector as well. So it's hugely relevant. We have so many big challenges and opportunities that, where your academic research and rigor practically applied can make a very big difference.
Brilliant, thank you. And I think everyone watching this will be getting a strong sense of why these three organisations with the British Library have come together, because actually it brings that sort of a bridge between these different worlds and creates a dialogue in and of itself, which hopefully will be quite exciting, both for those who submit their work, but also those who engage with the process more widely. There's a few questions that have come up in the chat that are questions around the awards process themselves. So I'll try and pick those up quite quickly, and anyone feel free to pitch in if you want to add anything. But Meza asks, if research can be published in several formats, is there a specific format it should be shared in, or can multiple versions be on one entry? I think we'd be more than happy to receive multiple formats in a single entry. And in fact, I think that's something that we would encourage, so we can see how it's been communicated, how the same body of research has been communicated in different ways. Holloway point everyone towards disseminating disciplinary research, and there is a CABS event next week, which I assume is available on the CABS website. It's been disseminated with various newsletters. And he also, Holloway also mentions, find out about how small businesses are collaborating with business schools on impact-focused research by looking at examples in the small business charter community. I guess, I'm sort of drawing to a close on the questions now, but I guess I have two final questions for each of you. I think Robert's already answered one of them earlier on several occasions in the conversation, which is there anything or anyone who embodies the type of impact that we'll be looking for in the awards? Obviously, Stephen Bartlett is someone who's an expert communicator, but perhaps people who works in the academic community who have connected in interesting ways that have caught any of your attention. And I guess the final question then for you all is, what does good look like? What would we want to see in terms of both the types of research that we'll be celebrating in February and the wider impacts that it might have? So you can take any or both of those questions, and I'll go to Katie first of all.
So an inspiring research leader. So there is a colleague at our institution. Her name is Alison Stoll. She has a background in practice, but she's been doing work on circular economy. She's a fantastic communicator. She's worked with many organizations looking at PIPL, on the PIPL project, which is looking at how plastics are used in the whole food cycle, from beginning to end, from production to consumption. And she started to really make a step change in the way that those organizations are thinking about their use of materials that can be very damaging to the environment. So she'd be my number one pick.
Brilliant. And for you, what's your sort of vision of what would most excite you in terms of an outcome of this award come February next year?
Okay, so I mean, I'd love to see SME practitioners feeling able to approach universities and academics to help them think about their challenges and do co-research projects together that really deliver change for them.
Brilliant. Thank you, Katie. And I missed out a question from Victoria, which is quite important, was how will the panel of judges be constituted? Will it consist solely of academics, or will there be a balance between academics, practitioners and industry experts? The answer is there will be a balance. The process is a rigorous academic one in terms of getting to the final shortlist, but the panel of judges will be from across the different sides of the various bridges that we're seeking to cross in and through these awards. Robert, you've obviously, Stephen Bartlett has cropped up a few times. Is there anybody in the academic community that you'd like to highlight embodying what we're looking for? And for you, what would be a vision of success for February next year?
So I'm going to answer those questions in reverse order, just to do some continuity from Katie. So if Katie's answer was that folks from smaller organisations might find universities less intimidating, more accessible, maybe more attractive places to go and get ideas, I'd like the very large community of academics in our UK business schools, there's nearly 20,000 people, I'd like them to feel like doing something beyond peer-reviewed publication in journal outlets is something which is also good for my career, and it's going to be recognised and celebrated and might reach that audience. And the very reason that those SME leaders or public sector leaders or other leaders might approach my universities because they read or saw or watched something that I'd produced that wasn't an amazing 4-rated journal publication. It was that plus. So that would be my definition of success, that we opened up the kind of range of things which are celebrated to include other new innovative forms and other older traditional forms in books that we somehow seem to have left to the side. So that would be my definition of success. And unlike Katie, I'm not going to pick somebody from our very large community of business and management researchers, because I feel that would be an attempt to lobby for the candidates, and I'm going to be very, other sources and other disciplines are available. But one really good example that does strike me recently, Anthony, was a guy called Lee Elliott Major, who's at Exeter University, who's the UK's first, and I think still the UK's only, professor of social mobility. And he produced a really excellent book last year, which contained some research that he'd done on the prospects of young children coming through the education system. But it contained in it this really small but really impactful turn of phrase, from going from talking about underprivileged to talking about under-resourced communities. And I think that's a really significant thing, because it reframes whose problem is this. And so, as an example of somebody who's done some rigorous work with the Department for Education and drawn on big sets of data and then produced a book that's had some impact, the impact isn't some enormously complicated formula. For me, the impact is that one little takeaway, that's a really interesting way of reframing that sense of disadvantage and advantage. And so I am sure amongst our business and management community, there will be other people who've done similar things in book or podcast or other forums that have similarly impactful takeaways for some of the practicing managers in the UK. And I'd look for examples like them, but I don't want to name one.
Yeah, reframing the approach as much as producing different answers. Interesting. Anne, either anyone that's caught your eye, and what's your vision of success for next February?
Well, I can give you an example that I've been thinking about that I think has had a huge impact and inspired a number of practitioners I know to think differently about something. And it is a well-known book and a well-known author. But the concept is something that Linda Grattan came up with, the 100-year life, right? We're all living longer, and what are the impacts of that? And what I've seen as a result, the knock-on impact of that has been quite phenomenal, because what it's spawned is a couple of leading practitioners that we know in our CMI community, like Edwina Dunn, who is the Dunn and Dunn Humby, who's a very successful serial entrepreneur. It's led her to do research on looking at the data to say just how significant older women are in framing how we spend money and how our economies are going to be shaped. And actually another practitioner, thinker, Aviva Wittenberg-Cox, has picked up on that, and it's inspired her to come up with the 4 quarters of your life, right? And the renaissance that happens in particular for many women in Q3, where is that 50-75 window, and she's deliberately used language from the corporate world to frame it in a way that practitioners can relate to. So I think, and then, you have the Center for Better Aging, and suddenly you have companies saying we really need to inspire these 50+ workers, and you have the government saying let's get them all back to work because it would help the productivity. So that simple thought of we're all living longer, and how are we going to cope with that, and how is it going to change our world of work, those 5 generations in the workplace. I think that's a great example of an idea that was seeded by an academic, but then has since found several afterlives, if you like, in the eyes of many practitioners, and really starting to shape modern workplace management thinking. And to me, that's a great example of that kind of snowballing effect of success and feeding off the academic and practicing community in really making a difference and improving our working lives.
Brilliant. Thank you, Anne. For me, by the way, Professor Alex Edmonds is the one that's caught my eye over the recent weeks and months at the London Business School. He's quite controversial, but his work is interesting, and there is real strong core academic rigor to it, but he communicates very well across a range of fields. But anyway, I think we've had a very rich conversation. Hopefully, everyone's got a better sense of the Management Publication of the Year Awards, what they're about, how we're approaching this, why we're approaching it the way we are, and what we want to achieve through it. And all that's left for me to say is thank you very much to Anne Franca, Katie Mason, Robert McIntosh for helping us explore that further. Details are available. Just search for Management Publication of the Year Awards, and they're on the BAM site, CMI site, and the CAB site as well. please do get your entries in by July the 5th, and we look forward to reading and reviewing them. And thank you very much for joining us this afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a great afternoon, folks.
Bye-bye.
Bye.